I didn't expect the moment my parents calmly handed my house to my brother to begin with a sentence that sounded so ordinary. "Daniel will be taking over the house from now on," my mother said during Sunday dinner, as if she were announcing who would carve the roast. For a few seconds I thought I must have misheard her. My fork hovered halfway between the plate and my mouth while the words slowly settled into the room like dust. The house. My house. The one on Willow Creek Road. The one I had spent 30 years paying for. I looked across the table at my younger brother Daniel. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just sat there quietly, hands folded together as if this conversation had already been decided somewhere else long before I arrived. "I'm Margaret Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and that house wasn't just a place to live. It was the center of our family's entire life. I helped my parents buy it decades ago when they were struggling after my father's small hardware business nearly collapsed. I took a second job back then, working late evenings bookkeeping for a local dentist just to make the mortgage payments easier for them. I remember the smell of fresh lumber when we remodeled the porch, the way the maple tree in the backyard grew taller every year, the creak in the third stair that no contractor ever managed to fix. Every corner of that house held a memory. And now, according to my mother's calm announcement, it belonged to Daniel. My father cleared his throat softly and repeated the same sentence, almost word for word, as if he had practiced it earlier. "Your brother needs the house more right now. Needs the house more." The words felt strangely rehearsed. I glanced at Daniel again, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he kept staring down at his plate. That silence unsettled me more than the announcement itself. Daniel hadn't lived in our hometown for almost 20 years. He moved to Arizona after college and rarely came back except for holidays. But 6 months ago he returned suddenly, saying he wanted to help take care of Mom and Dad as they got older. At first I was relieved. I had been handling most of their errands and appointments by myself for years. I thought having my brother around would finally make things easier. Now, sitting at that table, I began to wonder if I had misunderstood his return entirely. My mother reached for her glass of iced tea and spoke again in the same gentle tone. "We've talked about this a lot. Daniel will manage the property from now on." Manage the property. Another phrase that sounded strangely formal for a family conversation. I set my fork down slowly and asked the only question that made sense in that moment. "Since when?" No one answered right away. My father glanced at my mother. My mother glanced at Daniel. And Daniel finally lifted his eyes to meet mine for the first time that evening. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite place, something calm, almost confident, as if he already knew how this story was going to end. That was the moment the uneasy feeling began. Because houses don't simply change owners during Sunday dinner. Not without paperwork. Not without signatures. And definitely not without a lawyer somewhere in the background waiting to explain what had really happened. For the rest of that dinner I barely tasted the food in front of me. The roasted chicken, the mashed potatoes, even the green beans my mother always cooked the same way for as long as I could remember all sat untouched on my plate while the conversation moved around me like distant noise. My parents began talking about ordinary things again, the weather changing next week, a neighbor who was selling his truck, the rising cost of groceries. It was as if the announcement about the house had been nothing more than a minor detail in the evening. But inside my mind every word echoed louder than the last. I kept replaying my mother's sentence again and again. Daniel will be taking over the house. It did not make sense, not legally and not logically. 30 years earlier that house had nearly slipped through our fingers. My father's hardware store had been struggling after a large chain store opened just 2 miles down the highway. Sales dropped, bills stacked up, and for the first time in my life I saw real worry in my parents' faces. I was in my 30s back then, working as an office manager at a medical clinic about 20 minutes away. I still remember the night my father admitted they might have to sell the house. The dining room table had been covered with unpaid invoices and mortgage statements. My mother tried to stay optimistic, but the numbers told a different story. That was the moment I decided I would help them keep it. I took on extra work wherever I could find it. I handled bookkeeping for a dentist on Saturdays. I helped a local real estate agent organize paperwork in the evenings. It was exhausting, but month by month the mortgage payments became manageable again. Eventually my parents suggested something practical. If I was contributing so much toward the house, my name should be included on the property records. At the time it seemed like a simple solution that protected everyone. We signed the documents together at a small law office downtown. I remember the lawyer explaining that my ownership share would ensure the house remained stable for the family no matter what happened financially in the future. For decades after that, the arrangement never caused a single problem. Daniel built his life in Arizona. He called occasionally and visited during holidays, but the house was never really part of his world. I was the one who repaired the old fence when winter storms knocked it down. I was the one who drove my parents to medical appointments and grocery stores. I was the one who kept the property taxes paid on time. So when he returned 6 months ago, I welcomed him without hesitation. I believed he was finally ready to reconnect with the family. Looking back now, that may have been the first mistake I made. Because the more I thought about that dinner conversation, the more something felt carefully arranged beneath the surface. My parents had repeated the same explanation almost word for word. Daniel had remained unusually quiet the entire time. And somewhere deep in my memory I could still hear the lawyer from 30 years earlier saying one very specific thing. Property ownership does not simply change hands overnight. Not without paperwork. Not without signatures. And certainly not without someone in a legal office knowing exactly what was happening. That night I drove home slowly, letting the quiet of the road settle my thoughts. The streetlights passed one by one outside the windshield, long yellow reflections sliding across the dashboard while my mind kept circling the same question. What exactly had changed in the last 6 months? When Daniel first returned from Arizona, everything had seemed normal. He told us he was tired of the fast pace out west and wanted to spend more time with family. My parents were thrilled. My mother cried the day he showed up with 2 suitcases and said he planned to stay for a while. I remember feeling relieved more than anything else. For years I had been the one juggling everything. Doctor visits, grocery runs, home repairs, insurance paperwork. Having Daniel around meant I finally had someone to share the responsibility. At first he seemed eager to help. He started driving our father to appointments. He organized some of the financial files in the home office. He even suggested setting up automatic payments for the property taxes so nothing would ever be late again. My parents praised him constantly. They said it was wonderful to see their son taking charge. Looking back, I realized something else happened during that same period. Daniel slowly became the person handling every conversation about money. When the bank statements arrived in the mail, he opened them first. When the insurance renewal notice came, he reviewed it before anyone else. If a contractor called about repairs, Daniel answered the phone. None of it seemed strange at the time. In fact, I was grateful. After so many years of managing everything myself, stepping back felt almost like a vacation. But small details began to change. My father started repeating Daniel's opinions during family discussions. My mother began saying things like, "Daniel understands these things better than we do." Even the way they talked about the house shifted. They no longer called it Margaret's place the way they had for decades. Instead they referred to it simply as the property. The first moment that truly unsettled me came about 2 months ago. I had stopped by to bring groceries and found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by folders and legal envelopes. When I asked what he was working on, he smiled and said he was just organizing paperwork so everything would be easier for the future. At the time I did not ask more questions. Now I wished I had. Because during that dinner conversation earlier tonight, when my mother calmly announced that Daniel would be taking over the house, I noticed something in my brother's expression that I had never seen before. It was not surprise. It was not hesitation. It was certainty. The kind of certainty someone has when they already know how the situation will unfold. And that realization led to a second thought that would not leave my mind. If Daniel was so confident about the house suddenly becoming his, then somewhere there had to be documents that explained why. Documents that I had never seen. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen over Willow Creek Road. The house was quiet except for the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint ticking of the old wall clock in the hallway. I made a cup of coffee and sat at the small wooden table near the window, staring out at the backyard where the maple tree stretched its branches across the pale morning sky. Normally that view calmed me, but today my thoughts kept returning to the same uneasy conclusion. Something had been happening behind my back for months. After finishing my coffee, I decided to stop guessing and start looking for answers. I drove to my parents' house just after 8 o'clock. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had, quiet sidewalks, neatly trimmed lawns, and the familiar row of houses that had not changed much in decades. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was already there. That alone was unusual because he normally slept late. I walked up to the front door and stepped inside without knocking, the way I had done thousands of times over the years. The house smelled like fresh coffee and toasted bread. My mother was in the kitchen standing at the counter while Daniel sat at the table with several folders spread out in front of him. The moment he saw me, he gently closed one of the folders and slid it toward the center of the table. It was a small movement, but I noticed it immediately. "Good morning, Margaret," my mother said in her usual cheerful voice, as if nothing had happened the night before. Daniel nodded politely but did not say much. Instead he gathered the papers into a neat stack and placed them inside a leather briefcase beside his chair. I tried to sound casual when I spoke. I asked what they were working on so early in the morning. Daniel answered quickly, explaining that he was simply organizing financial documents for our parents so everything would be easier in the future. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet the atmosphere in the room felt strangely tense. My father soon entered from the living room carrying the morning newspaper. He greeted me warmly, but when I mentioned the conversation from dinner the previous night, both of my parents exchanged a brief glance before answering. My father repeated the same phrase he had used earlier. "Daniel will handle the house now. It is the practical decision." Practical. The word lingered in the air like an echo. I watched Daniel closely while my father spoke. He remained calm, almost relaxed, as though the outcome of this situation was already guaranteed. That confidence made something inside me tighten. Because if Daniel truly believed the house now belonged to him, then somewhere there had to be proof that supported his belief. And the way he had quietly closed that folder when I walked into the kitchen told me exactly where that proof might be hiding. After leaving my parents' house that morning, I sat in my car for several minutes without starting the engine. The leather briefcase Daniel had placed beside his chair kept returning to my mind. The way he had calmly closed the folder the moment I walked in was not the reaction of someone simply organizing paperwork. It was the reaction of someone protecting something. I finally started the car and drove home, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me the entire afternoon. Around 2 o'clock I decided I could not wait any longer. If there were documents connected to the house, then the one person who would know the truth was the lawyer who handled the property decades earlier. His name was Thomas Caldwell. I still remembered the small office building where we had signed the original paperwork nearly 30 years ago. It stood just off Main Street, across from the old brick courthouse that had been part of our town for generations. When I arrived, the building looked exactly the same. The brass plaque near the door still read Caldwell and Associates. I stepped inside and the faint smell of paper and polished wood instantly brought back memories of that day long ago when my parents and I had signed the property documents together. A receptionist greeted me politely and asked how she could help. I explained that I had once worked with Mr. Caldwell regarding property records connected to my family. She checked a calendar and then looked up with a small smile. Mr. Caldwell is still practicing law here, she said. Would you like to speak with him? A few minutes later I was sitting across from a man who looked older but unmistakably familiar. His hair had turned almost completely silver, yet his calm, thoughtful manner had not changed at all. He recognized my name immediately. Margaret Whitmore, he said warmly. It has been quite a few years. I nodded and tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. I told him about the dinner conversation, about my parents saying the house would now belong to Daniel, and about the growing sense that something had been arranged without my knowledge. Mr. Caldwell listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together. For several seconds he said nothing. That silence alone told me he understood the seriousness of what I was asking. Finally he stood up and walked to a tall filing cabinet behind his desk. He opened one of the drawers and carefully removed a thin folder labeled with my family name. When he returned to the desk he placed the folder in front of him but did not open it right away. Instead he looked directly at me with an expression that was both thoughtful and cautious. Margaret, he said slowly, property records do not simply change overnight. Not without proper legal steps. Then he rested his hand lightly on the folder and added one sentence that made my pulse quicken immediately. There is also something else you should know about your parents' estate that may become very important. Mr. Caldwell's words hung in the quiet office like the slow turning of a key inside a lock. I sat there watching his hand resting on the thin folder while a dozen possibilities moved through my mind at once. Something else you should know about your parents' estate. The phrase sounded simple, but the way he said it made it clear this was not a minor detail. He finally opened the folder and turned a few pages carefully, as if he were revisiting something that had been waiting for a long time. The documents inside were older than the recent paperwork Daniel had been organizing at my parents' house. I recognized the signatures immediately. My father's careful handwriting. My mother's looping script. And my own name written clearly across one of the property forms from decades earlier. Mr. Caldwell looked up and spoke in the calm, measured tone that lawyers use when every word matters. Margaret, when your parents updated their estate documents several years ago, they included specific protections for the house on Willow Creek Road. The purpose was to make sure the property remained stable for the person who had contributed to it the most. I felt a small wave of relief mixed with confusion. That arrangement sounded exactly like the understanding my parents and I had agreed to years ago. But the conversation at dinner the previous night suggested something very different. Mr. Caldwell seemed to sense my uncertainty. He explained that the house was tied not only to the original property records but also to the structure of my parents' will. That meant no one could legally transfer or reassign ownership without following very clear legal steps. And according to the records in front of him, no such steps had been completed. I asked him directly if Daniel could have somehow changed the paperwork recently. Mr. Caldwell shook his head slowly. Property transfers require legal filings with the county office, he said. If such a change had been made, it would appear in public records immediately. Then he turned the folder slightly so I could see the last page inside. At the top was a document labeled Estate Plan Amendment. It had been signed several years earlier, long before Daniel returned from Arizona. Mr. Caldwell tapped the page gently with one finger. This document explains why the situation you described at dinner does not match the legal structure of your parents' estate. I felt my heartbeat quicken as I leaned forward in the chair. The quiet office suddenly felt much smaller than it had when I walked in. Mr. Caldwell closed the folder again and folded his hands on the desk. The will connected to this estate has not been formally opened or reviewed in a family setting yet, he said carefully. That typically happens during an official meeting when all relevant parties are present. Then he looked at me with the same thoughtful expression he had when I first sat down in his office. Given what you have told me about your brother's confidence regarding the house, I believe it would be wise for that meeting to happen sooner rather than later. 2 days later I returned to the same office on Main Street, this time with a heavier feeling in my chest. Mr. Caldwell had arranged a formal meeting and asked that everyone involved be present. When I stepped inside the conference room, the long wooden table was already prepared with several folders placed neatly along its surface. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows and stretched across the polished wood, creating a quiet and almost solemn atmosphere. Daniel was already seated near the far end of the table when I arrived. He looked relaxed, leaning slightly back in his chair with his hands folded together. My parents sat beside him, both appearing calm and confident. For a moment I wondered if they had already convinced themselves that the situation was settled. Daniel gave me a small nod when I walked in, the same calm expression on his face that I had noticed during dinner earlier in the week. That same quiet certainty remained in his eyes. Mr. Caldwell entered the room a few minutes later carrying a thick folder and placed it carefully in front of him at the center of the table. "Thank you all for coming," he said in his steady professional voice. "There are several matters regarding the Whitmore estate that require clarification." My father nodded as if this meeting was nothing more than a routine formality. My mother folded her hands in her lap and looked toward Daniel, almost as if she expected the conversation to confirm what had already been discussed at home. Daniel remained silent, though the slight upward curve of his lips suggested he felt completely certain about how the afternoon would unfold. I sat quietly and watched each of them, trying to read the expressions around the table. The tension in the room was subtle but unmistakable. Mr. Caldwell opened the folder slowly and removed a stack of documents. Before reviewing them, he spoke again in the calm voice that carried easily across the room. "Over the past week I have been informed that there may be confusion regarding the ownership and future control of the property on Willow Creek Road." My father cleared his throat and answered confidently. "There is no confusion," he said. "Daniel will be managing the house from now on." My mother nodded in agreement. Daniel finally leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table with an air of quiet assurance. "The house will stay in the family," he added, as if the matter were already settled. Mr. Caldwell listened carefully without interrupting. Then he placed one document on the table in front of him and adjusted his glasses. "The ownership and inheritance of that property are connected to the structure of the Whitmore estate plan," he explained. "And according to the official documents on file, the outcome of that plan cannot be determined until the will has been formally reviewed." The room grew noticeably quieter. Daniel remained calm, but I noticed his eyes briefly shift toward the folder in front of the lawyer. Mr. Caldwell then reached for a sealed envelope resting inside the file and placed it carefully on the table. "This document contains the final instructions regarding the property and the distribution of assets within the Whitmore estate," he said. His hand rested lightly on the envelope as he looked around the table. "Once this is opened and read, there will be no remaining uncertainty about who the house truly belongs to." Mr. Caldwell's hand rested on the sealed envelope for a brief moment before he opened it with careful precision. The sound of the paper tearing was quiet, yet in the silent room it seemed louder than anything else. Everyone at the table watched him closely. My father leaned forward slightly. My mother clasped her hands together in her lap. Daniel remained still, though the confident posture he had carried into the room now seemed just a little tighter around the shoulders. Mr. Caldwell removed the document inside and unfolded it slowly before adjusting his glasses and beginning to read. His voice was calm and measured, the same professional tone he had used throughout the meeting. "The document," he explained, "was the final estate instruction prepared by my parents several years earlier when they updated their legal plans. It described how the property on Willow Creek Road would be handled in the future and who would ultimately retain ownership." As he continued reading, the room grew even quieter. According to the instructions written in the will, the house was to remain legally connected to the individual who had invested the most time, financial support, and responsibility into maintaining it over the years. That statement alone caused a subtle shift around the table. My mother's eyes moved briefly toward my father. Daniel remained still, but the certainty in his expression began to fade. Mr. Caldwell continued reading the next section of the document. It explained that the purpose of this clause was to prevent any sudden transfer of the house to another family member who had not contributed equally to the property's stability. The language was clear and carefully written, leaving little room for interpretation. My heart began to beat faster as the meaning behind those words slowly settled into the room. Mr. Caldwell then reached the final paragraph and paused for a moment before speaking again. This section names the person who retains full legal authority regarding the property. He looked down at the page once more and read the name written there. Margaret Whitmore. For a moment no one spoke. The silence stretched across the room as the words fully registered with everyone present. My father leaned back in his chair with a surprised expression. My mother blinked several times as if trying to process what she had just heard. Daniel's reaction was the most noticeable. The calm confidence he had carried earlier had completely disappeared. He stared at the document in front of the lawyer, clearly realizing that the outcome he had expected was not the one written in the official record. Mr. Caldwell placed the document carefully back onto the table and spoke in the same steady voice. According to the legally filed estate instructions, the house on Willow Creek Road remains under Margaret Whitmore's authority. No transfer of ownership can occur without her approval. The meeting room remained quiet for several seconds longer, but the uncertainty that had hung over the situation for days had finally been replaced with something much clearer. The truth had been inside that sealed envelope the entire time, waiting for the moment it would finally be read aloud. The silence that followed Mr. Caldwell's final words felt different from the tension that had filled the room earlier. This time it was not confusion or uncertainty. It was realization. My father looked down at the polished wooden table as if replaying the last few weeks in his mind. My mother slowly exhaled and rested her hands together, her expression shifting from confidence to quiet reflection. Daniel remained motionless for several seconds, staring at the document in front of the lawyer as though it might somehow change if he looked long enough. But the words had already been read. The instructions had already been confirmed. The house on Willow Creek Road was still legally under my authority. Mr. Caldwell carefully gathered the documents and placed them back into the folder. His voice remained steady and professional when he spoke again, explaining that the estate plan had been structured specifically to protect the property from any sudden decisions or misunderstandings within the family. The clause had been written years earlier with the intention of honoring the person who had carried the greatest responsibility for maintaining the home. Hearing that explanation out loud brought back memories that stretched across decades. Early mornings repairing the old porch railing. Evenings reviewing property tax statements at the kitchen table. Weekends spent repainting the fence or clearing leaves from the backyard before winter storms arrived. Those small responsibilities had never felt extraordinary at the time. They were simply part of caring for the place that held our family together. My father finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been earlier in the meeting. I had forgotten how carefully we arranged all of that, he admitted. Your mother and I wanted to make sure the house would stay with the person who truly built its future. My mother nodded slowly, the earlier certainty gone from her expression. Daniel leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. For the first time since the meeting began, the confidence he had carried seemed to dissolve into something more thoughtful. He looked toward me briefly before lowering his eyes again. No one raised their voices. No one argued. The document had already settled the matter with calm clarity. After a few more minutes, Mr. Caldwell closed the folder and stood from the table, signaling that the discussion had reached its conclusion. I thanked him quietly before leaving the office. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the sidewalk, and the familiar town streets looked exactly the way they always had. Yet something inside me felt lighter than it had in days. The uncertainty that had clouded everything since that dinner conversation was gone. The truth had been written years earlier, sealed in a document that simply needed the right moment to be opened. As I drove back toward Willow Creek Road, the maple tree in the yard came into view from the distance just as it had thousands of times before. The house looked unchanged, standing quietly beneath the branches that had grown alongside our family for decades. And for the first time since the conversation at dinner began this entire story, I understood something clearly. Some answers do not come from arguments or assumptions. Sometimes they have been waiting patiently all along, written in ink and protected by time, ready to speak for themselves when the moment finally arrives.